Excellent. All right. Well, I am going to get us started. And I think for this hour, I know we've got people logging in, and there'll probably be a couple of people who join in the coming minutes. So I think the best way to get started is probably to have each of us go through and just talk a little bit about who we are and what we do. I know a couple of you have slides to help us understand what you do in the framework. So I'll kick us off. I'm Nicole. My background is in neuroscience, but I'm a doctor of public health. And over the years, with that combination, I have ended up working in and around sport in a number of ways. And yet, a couple of you might have been on the panel yesterday. I listened to the panel yesterday that was on, and I said, but in fact, I don't have a sport background at all. I come at it from a human behavior and public health standpoint. And what I've learned over the years, actually, it was the United Nations that first pulled me into sport. It just became so obvious to me that sport is a form of diplomacy, and you can do so much good through sport. And so currently, I've got projects all over the world, but the one that I'm most proud of and most involved with at the moment is called Feed a Billion. And our goal is to feed a billion children on any given day. And food insecurity is so prominent right now all over the world and growing with the pandemic. And so in cases like India, we have found that giving children food on football fields is an ideal way to ensure that they get all the nutrients they need for the day. It also gets them to play and to interact in ways that they can't when they can't go to school. So I'm happy to talk about all things clean water, access to food, health, development, and human rights issues as they pertain to sport. John, you want to go next?
Thank you, Nicole. Yeah, it's brilliant to hear what you're doing out in India, and I had the pleasure of being on a panel with Nicole yesterday. So it's great to be back together. My name is John. It's early in the morning for me. It's just come 5 a.m. because I'm living over the other side of the world in Indonesia. You actually may hear the call to prayer in the background going around the valley that I live in. But I've been working and living over here for the last 13 years. And I look at sport development from the other angle from Nicole, because my life has been in sport. I was a sportsman all my life. I never got paid to play, but it was always the kind of the main driving force, if you like, how I learned to be a young man, a leader. And so I passionately believed in the power of sport. And so at the age of 19, started doing my coaching badges, and in particular focus on soccer, football. Ended up getting a very top coaching badge, and then realizing that this badge could enable me to be able to get into places and to go to places, and then be able to share the power of sport, but realizing that power brings responsibility. If we're just focused on the sport, is that truly the heart of sport? And even if you look at the high level sport, you see the power of the Pep Guardiola, the Jurgen Klopp, these amazing soccer coaches, but the way that they coach is very much a kind of a mentor, a father, a guide. And so often that's missed when you go around the world, where you suddenly then the coach becomes an authoritarian kind of person. And so over the course of the last 16 years, been doing many coaching clinics around Asia in particular, trying to encourage people to view coaching with different eyes. And then alongside that then has been this whole kind of desire as well to connect football with community. Well, how can we do that? And in particular, if we look at kind of human rights, we do various different programs aligned with the UN SDGs, and I'll just highlight one that in particular, as we look at human rights. Sadly, if you look at kind of the UN SDG number 16, which is peace and social justice, we're all looking for peace, and probably the war that's raised for longest in the world has probably been the war between men and women and gender-based violence. During lockdown, we saw how there was this increase in gender-based violence, because people together, men together, taking it out upon their wives. And so suddenly now it's been talked about more and more, but we've realized within Asia, 26% of men have raped a woman in their lifetime. It's a horrific stat. 50% of first-time offenders are teenage boys. The people group predominantly that I work with, the people group predominantly sport engages with, teenage boys. Just so, what an opportunity I would argue for the sport development sector. If the sport for development sector is engaging in that people group, and that people group predominantly are first-time offenders of gender-based violence, well, if we think about human rights, what are we doing to target the gender-based violence abuse that is happening? Because when you talk to teenage boys, why do they do it? Over 50% say entitlement and entertainment. Fundamentally, there's something wrong in the thinking of teenage boys about what it is to be a man and what is positive masculinity, and how can we target that as we try and do it through sport to bring about a new way of thinking, and hopefully then safer, more peaceful societies for women to grow up in. So that's a little bit about what we do. Nicole, I'm looking forward to being involved in the panel and getting to hear from the other gentlemen.
And Guido, over to you.
Yeah. Yes, happy to go next. Thank you, Lai. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, John. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I am Guido Battaglia. I am the head of policy and outreach with an institution called the Center for Sport and Human Rights. As you may hear from my accent, I am Italian, living in Switzerland. And I joined the world of sport 3-4 years ago, but like Nicole, my previous experience were not with sport. I've been working with international institutions, and previously I worked with organizations like the World Economic Forum and other international organizations on responsible business conduct, and really trying to apply international standards to the way business and corporate world operates throughout the globe. This provided me with experience with complex sectors such as mining, infrastructure development, commodity trading. And when I joined the world of sports 3-4 years ago, I of course understood the power of sport, the strong message of unity, and the capacity really to bring people together. But at the same time, also the understanding that sport is an activity like others. And if on one hand, there are many positive impacts and positive aspects, on the other hand, there may be people being in trouble and having suffering negative impacts from sport. I had the privilege to be one of the persons involved as of the beginning with the establishment of a new institution called the Center for Sport and Human Rights. And this is a new organization that is bringing together actors from different stakeholder groups and willing to address human rights in the world of sport. Nicole, I have some slides and I'm happy to present our work, but I wonder if perhaps we would just like to go and conclude the tour de table beforehand, and then I open the slide as you prefer.
That's fine with me. Yeah.
So let me share my.
I think it's good now. Yeah.
Okay, let me share my screen so that I can provide you with some background and some context related to the work of the Center for Sport and Human Rights. Can everybody see my screen? So really the starting point, why human rights matter to sport. I think we already mentioned this. Sports can change the world, but if human rights and the human rights of those who are affected by sport are not affected, negative impacts may arise. So it is very important that sport organizations and all the other stakeholders that are involved in sport conduct due diligence, and respect athletes and stakeholders that are involved in their activities. So there is a lot of work to do in the sector, but and we can think about examples, athletes being abused, discrimination and racism being big issues affecting athletes at the elite, but also grassroots level. We can think about child labor and forced labor in value chain when it comes to organization of mega sporting events, lack of access to effective remedy being an issue for people in sport around the world. So really the idea was, how can we address these complex issues? Different geographies, different players, different power of the actors involved. Well, the idea was to establish a center for sport and human rights. Here you can see the two leaders, Mary Robinson, former president of Ireland, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, chair of the elders, and our CEO, Mary Harvey, American citizen, former Olympic champion, FIFA world champion, and sport executive with experience with FIFA and other organizations. They are leading the efforts of the center, and of course they are joined by a broad network of institutions that are part of the advisory council of the center. This includes sport organizations, sponsors, broadcasters, governments, NGOs, civil society representatives, trade unions, and international organizations. It is a complex world. The issues are complex. It is only through engagement with all these stakeholders and through collective action that we can advance on this topic. What do? We create a safe space for addressing these issues. We mobilize the actors that are in a position to make a difference, and we work together to support, enable, and promote prevention of harms, most important thing, access to remedy, and then when it comes to events, but also how sport is conducted, make sure that there is a positive legacy behind. Just a few words on how the center is structured and how the different players interact. We believe that stakeholder engagement and discussion with those who are affected by sport is the key priority. And you can see that they're at the center of this circle. International intergovernmental organizations and UN agencies such as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the International Labour Organization, UNESCO, and other UN institutions basically guarantee the legitimacy of our work, because our work is grounded on internationally recognized human rights standards. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the ILO Declarations on Rights of Workers, the International Covenants on Civil Rights, and of course also the OECD guidelines for responsible multinationals. We're not reinventing the wheel. We're working on the basis of standards that have been acknowledged and endorsed unanimously by all the countries. And the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights have officially been endorsed here in Geneva by the Human Rights Council in 2013. This is the basis of our work. On the basis of these principles and normative standards, we mobilize the actors who make the difference. Governments, sport governing bodies, organizing committees, sponsors, and we work together to address the issues. And I would like to share with you some examples to make all this idea a bit more concrete. We provide tools. All these tools are outcomes of consultations with all the different stakeholders. These tools cover various issues such as governance in sport organizations. How can we embed a human rights approach to the governance of these organizations? Human rights in the mega sporting event life cycle. from bidding to legacy. What are the issues that have to be taken into account? What can be anticipated? What can be done to prevent potential harm? And how can the different actors that are involved in such a big effort can work together to prevent them? The important role of broadcasters and sponsors. They sign important contracts. They conduct due diligence and really try to understand where the risks are, and can exert a lot of leverage on the actors they're working with. Then, of course, the impact of COVID-19 being very, very important for sport, being dramatic for sport. How can we respond to this crisis from a human rights perspective and keeping a people-centered approach to this crisis? These are just some of the tools we're developing. Very important is dialogue, is understanding, in particular from affected groups, okay, what are the issues, and can we create a safe space and a forum for addressing these issues, and understanding what are the systemic solutions that can be found so that all around the world, less people will be negatively impacted by sport. Our flagship event is called the Sporting Chance Forum. We held different sessions in the past years in Washington, in Paris, in Geneva. We were supposed to be in Mexico City this year. The circumstances are not allowing it, but we look forward to flying to Mexico next year. Concrete example of the work we're doing with stakeholders. When it comes to mega sporting events, you know that the 2026 FIFA World Cup was awarded to the United States, to Mexico, and Canada. We're working with the 23 candidate cities that are willing to host these games, and we're working with child rights experts and organizations and other stakeholders to understand together with these cities, okay, what does it mean in terms of impact for children, the organization of such an event? What are the potential impacts? How can they be mitigated? And what are the lessons that we can share and learn from other activities? This is ongoing work, and we're engaging with all these cities to work together and develop a blueprint that is common for everyone. Another example, traditionally all around the world of sport and the world of human rights did not find easy to talk to each other. We would like to help different institutions that are active around the world bridge this gap. One example is work we are conducting in Africa in collaboration with Commonwealth Sport to bring together national human rights institutions and national Olympic committees and national Commonwealth Games associations, and have them talk together, discuss what their operations are, what their activities are, what the issues are, and make sure that when it comes to policy development, there is more alignment and more dialogue between these different worlds so that negative impacts can be prevented and mitigated. Last example, as I mentioned before, lack of access to effective remedy is a big issue for people involved in sport. We heard about horrible, egregious human rights abuse and cases in different geographies around the world. And what we would like to understand with all the stakeholders involved is, okay, can we find a way to strengthen access to effective remedy for athletes in particular, but everyone involved in sports? It is a complex issue. Many institutions are involved. The center would really like to play an important role in convening and facilitating a constructive dialogue between the actors involved. This is a short presentation of the activities of the center. Of course, here you can find my email address. I'm happy to provide any additional information you may need. It is really an important moment, I think, for the sport and human rights movement. The center is the house where everyone can come together and work collectively to address human rights issues. looking forward to continuing this journey. And yes, contact me if you have any additional questions. Thank you very much.
Excellent. I guess I'll follow from Guido, and really excellent to be a part of this conversation today. Guido did a really good work, really important work around the intersection between the sport for development world and the human rights community. And, I think that's always a really important area to kind of see the evolution and the intersection. I know a lot of our work tends to engage in those different dimensions, as we've heard today even already. And so for me too, that's been kind of an important intersection. I started working in the disability in sports space, and that evolved into more of the broader kind of sport for development, and then also into the human rights space. In the early 2000s, I worked and helped to draft the article on sport, the right to sport, for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And then that then led into, at the same time as I was involved with that, is really when the growth of the sport for development sector was emerging. And then at that time, I was also early, we were thinking about different initiatives, and we put together the proposal, a number of different stakeholders. I was more on the civil society side of things. We put together the proposal for the International Day of Sport for Development piece. And so I've been involved behind the scenes with the United Nations agencies in terms of orchestrating and coordinating and kind of promoting the sport for development world, but also how that intersects into the human rights space. In 2006, my colleagues and I, several different scholars, we began to do more research and following upon work that had been done by folks like Bruce Kidd and Richard Lapchick and Harry Edwards, and really beginning to look at what is the state of the sport and human rights field. And we also started to look at the intersections with athlete activism and various other elements of thinking about and understanding the connections of human rights advocacy in and through sport. And so that kind of became an area. We developed this initiative at the time, and it's really been more of a research education advocacy project called Athletes for Human Rights. And it's been really amazing to see just the evolution of the field, particularly in the last, and seeing the amazing presentation from Guido and the center and all the work that's being done, the multi-stakeholder efforts to really begin to show the power and the importance of human rights and that conversation. It over even now in some ways in the current environment, there's still this thought of how a human rights conversation is a bad or a negative conversation, rather than really having a framework of having a human rights conversation is actually a really good conversation and an important conversation. And so, I think that mindset shift and that paradigm shift of understanding the importance of human rights conversations and really the work that my colleagues and I have focused on has been particularly around minority rights. So whether it's on race or gender, sexual orientation, disability, other types of minorities, in terms of diversity and inclusion and how that intersects from a human rights framework. But it's really just amazing to see. I mean, even, we can talk more in the discussion, but even some of the recent cases of, the rugby ban that's currently in place, and, what kind of advocacy are we seeing? What kind of mobilization? What kind of, not just one example of, how do we hold accountability? And that's what the center and other stakeholders are doing. But, we can kind of see a lip service tokenism for human rights. We have it maybe in writing, or we kind of spout it as an important principle, but then when it comes down to implementation and practice, what does that mean? And so these have been important conversations. For me, I competed in the 96 and the 2004 in the Paralympic Games. I was on the US soccer team for a stretch. And so that experience for me as an athlete and seeing these issues within the Olympic and Paralympic space. And then my journey into academia at Brown University, and then various institutions of higher education, and then teaching now sport and human rights. So it's really a powerful space, and it's really important. And I see it gaining more traction, but it's also like, how do we make sure that it sticks and we're not just giving it, so that's why I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. So I'll turn it back to Nicole, and I'm really looking forward to the dialogue we're going to have together.
Thank you, everyone. So something that stood out to me as each of us spoke was that we, in different ways, talked about intersection and how difficult some of these conversations are to have. Actually, Guido, you said something that reminded me. I used to actually host this dinner series. I called it a seat at the table. And the point was to try and solve a problem. And I invited 20 people, but no one at the table could have the same, like they couldn't touch the problem in the same way. And the point was just, we needed at least 20 different perspectives before we could even know that we were asking the right questions. And so, as we all talked about all the different stakeholders, I would even add, and wearing my very American hat at the moment, I think the general public often misunderstands the role of sport, particularly when we say human rights. And I think they immediately jump to certain things. And here in the U.S., there are social issues that immediately come to mind. And yet the depth and breadth of how sport intersects with human rights issues is something that's difficult. As you say, it's difficult to talk about and often misunderstood. So I guess the question I would have for everyone else, is how do you go about approaching and securing partnerships? Whether it's the local NGOs, whether it's those multinational corporations that you have to, often bring them along, and we're reaching a place where corporate social good has a place, and yet, to your point about lip service, how do you make sure they're the right partners to share your message? So yeah, just how do you partner, and how do you ensure that you're finding the right kinds of government, NGO, academic, et cetera, partners to ensure that we're all doing the right work the right way?
Guido, do you want to go?
Happy to kick off. You're on mute, Nicole.
Yeah, I'm just saying, whoever isn't on mute, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah.
No, happy to kick off. No, developing partnership is the topic, and something also that Eli mentioned beforehand. Approaching organizations and approach them by telling them, okay, we would like to discuss human rights. It's something scary for many of them. They automatically take one step back, and say, oh my God, what are we talking about? I think there is a nice quote from Eleanor Roosevelt that said that human rights are everywhere in the little things we do, and this is the important trigger. I think it is somehow to explain that we're talking about things that happen in our everyday life. And the other important thing, in particular when approaching, for example, sport organizations, it's, you're already doing some of this work. Maybe you don't call it human rights. You're calling it safeguarding, you're calling it ethics, but you're already working on this. From a center perspective, what we're offering is a framework that would allow them to have a broad holistic approach to the issues at stake. And this is based, again, on international standards. Is something that was agreed, was discussed, is based on principles that are at the basis of really our society. So it should not be something too difficult to sell. But yes, I think that the idea when it comes to developing partnership is really trying to make sure that when we explain what we're talking about, we can be as concrete as possible, and we can explain that the good thing about the framework we are developing is that we're promoting is that it is a framework that identifies the responsibilities of these different stakeholders, that invites each stakeholder to conduct due diligence, to identify the risk, to know what you're doing, what you're talking about, and then to take informed decision on the basis of information that you have gathered beforehand. I think that this is really the game changer. And you can get information only if you have uncomfortable conversations, because it is tough. You know, we have many non-governmental organizations that are part of the Center for Sport and Human Rights, and of course, for some organizations, it may be tough to hear, from them that what is wrong, what can be done better, were there opportunities for improvement. But this is the way, basically, to advance and make progress. What the center really hopes to do is to create a safe space where partnership can be further developed, and there is mutual respect and understanding of the different issues, and we can take a step forward together. But yeah, it is an important point, and how to reach out to the different actors is not easy.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think that it's been an area of kind of building those networks and building those coalitions, and especially in the athlete community, there's been more and more of these groups to kind of sign on or be a part of advocacy in different ways, but also in terms of just your point about diversity and just different ways of thinking. We've had a forum that I've helped organize with the Muhammad Ali Foundation, the center, for the last few years, and part of it's just the fun and the interesting and just the beauty, really, of just diverse stakeholders coming together and being creative and finding new ideas, new solutions. A couple of years ago, we did have a human rights theme, and we tried to think about, could there be, different types of human rights in sport, through sport, the whole notion of, in the hierarchy of rights, the right to sport is still not as strong, or the right to play, all that. And so how do we continue to evolve that? And but I also think, just in terms of how we, when we build teams, just that notion of diversity is really important. So my core colleagues and we oftentimes think about the web and the ladder, the ladder type of thinking and the web type of thinking. And some people think more macro and systems, and other people think more linearly. And so being able to bring different types of that type of thinking to these problems, is just really important. And I do think that in the human rights space, it's just part of what I've seen a little bit is it's just a small community. And the more and more we can kind of reach what, that aren't drinking the Kool-Aid yet, or, the unconverted. I just think that this, in the same way that so many fans are passionate about sport in different ways, if we could get the fan world so passionate about human rights, I mean, that, even sports fans for human rights, that kind of thing, and that already is happening in some ways, but to continue to grow these networks and that innovation that can happen to really, even on the, we have Paul Hunt from Sport and Dev, and many people, Beth from the Institute at San Jose State, and there's part of it is these different webs and networks and finding ways to bring them together.
Yeah, thank you, Ayla. I think my perspective, obviously living in Asia, and it's a completely different perspective. The reason being is because I can come to these conferences in America and Beyond Sport, this conference, other conferences, and it's so exciting to hear about, purpose business and how there's been a big game changer. There was a couple of organizations at the last conference I was at who were saying, oh, we've now, the purpose of business isn't profit, it's purpose. I contacted their head office in Jakarta, and they said, that's very good. That may be in America, but that's not happening in Asia. And it was completely and utterly everything I tried to propose to them was completely quashed. And so I think there are at the moment conversations that are happening in America, maybe happening in Geneva or in London, definitely haven't filtered down to this part of the world. And so that's frustration. And like, for example, one thing that's happening next year is the Under-20 World Cup that's coming to Indonesia. So Indonesia is so excited. This is probably going to be the largest sporting event they've probably hosted. And so we've been talking to them about legacy project. Now, for them, the legacy project is about them winning, and they're not thinking any social cause. They're putting all their money into them winning. They're not going to win it. I can guarantee you that straight away. But when we've been saying to them, well, what's the legacy message? What do you want to go? What do you want to leave the Indonesian people? Or when the world comes and looks at this tournament, what's the message that you want to be talking about? So we've been talking to them about, again, the whole idea about gender-based violence, can give sexism the red card. You know, FIFA have been starting to kind of move in that direction already. You know, could there be something? But at the moment, hitting brick walls. Why? Because within the sporting organizations over here, their focus is just to win, just to have the prestige of winning the tournament, because that for them is political power, is economic power, and it is kind of where the rubber hits the road here at the moment. So I think so many of these conversations that are happening in other parts of the world are great, but when I relate to what's happening in different parts of Asia, it's still incredibly focused on the bottom line of winning tournaments and finances. So I think the engagement of human rights and sport in some areas is really happening, which is great. In other areas, there's a long, long, long way to go.
I have to agree with you.
Do you think COVID is changing things at all? I mean, do you think the current environment is, sorry, just had to ask the question. I mean, do you think that this environment we're living in now is actually going to change these dynamics of the way we're prioritizing, or do you feel like it's not really going to have an impact?
I think at the moment, to be honest with you, it's not having a huge impact. I think people's people's perception of COVID within, again, I say Asia is too far bigger, within Indonesia, I think it's fair to say, is they see as diseases is caused disruption to their daily routine and to what's going on. And they're just looking back to getting back to normal life. There's no new normal. It's just going back to what it was. And so idea of bringing in new way of thinking and new way of working isn't there. And so the only way that we're trying to advocate to kind of think a different way about sport, and for example, the World Cup next year, is by bringing in other partners like the KNVB, who we're already working with, because they have a weight of a voice that I don't. And so, but it's been incredibly hard. It's been incredibly slow because people's perceptions still are sport is about winning, it's about tournaments, and if we win, we will be seen as successful. If we lose, doesn't matter what legacy program we have, we will be seen as failure if we don't get to the quarterfinals.
Yeah, and I'll agree with that. And I was going to agree with your first point, but now I'll agree with both in that we spoke a little bit yesterday, if anyone listened in on the Asia panel, and in some of the communities that I work in, we've not seen a lot of change. And in fact, I told a very brief story about one of our sites. Our local partner was run out because of the misinformation and disinformation campaigns around COVID. And so there was one white person, and it was deemed that they were the culprit of COVID. And so, like, you know, all these unintended consequences happened that made it so that we can't distribute food, we can't provide healthcare, and we use the sport fields for these things. And so there's a lot happening there that we don't actually know how to fully handle at the moment, because how do we rebuild that trust that was eroded in a way that we had nothing to do with? But you know, so I think every community is really, really different. And so, you know, when he says those things, I'm like, yeah, in some places that's wholly accurate. And I don't see this having much of a change at all. There are other places that I do. But I laughed when you said, even in the US, you're hearing more about purpose over profit. And yeah, I'm not sure that I agree with that.
Yeah, just a little bit, not much. Yeah.
Right. And it's, you know, to Eli's point, it's certainly the thing to say. And there is certainly a great PR strategy in social good. But I would hesitate that anyone would, be like, profit doesn't matter, winning doesn't matter, as long as we're helping. I think it's just a much nicer, more acceptable thing to say here. But speaking of that sort of activism, I wrote a couple notes while we were all talking about influence and messaging. And so I'm interested to hear how you all use that to communicate with the public, because we've seen a lot of messaging that's very active in the US, polarizing at times. And yet, if anyone asked me what was one of like the craziest, most important messages sent this year, of all things, I would say, very American, NASCAR. To see the drivers as the first sport that came back to normal in the US, to see the drivers with small teams wearing masks, and much of their fan base was very, very anti-mask. No one spoke about it. It was just the accepted norm. And for that to end up on every screen in America as something totally normalized, the public health person went, oh, that public health messaging just did wonders for a group of people that we've not been able to communicate with just by watching athletes that they respect. And then to see the NBA do so well with the bubble. It can be done. All these people said it can't. It can't, right? So I'm interested to hear from you all about that activism piece, but also the messaging. How do you use sport and athletes to message around human rights?
Eli and John, would you like to go first? We go the other way around this time.
Eli, you're off mute, so I'm just going to say you go first.
Sure, I can just share a few thoughts. And yeah, really interesting to hear John and Guido and you too, Nicole. Yeah, I think it's always interesting to think about like tactics and the different strategies and how to approach athlete advocacy, and kind of seeing, more explicit tactics and more subtle, and, those people that are marching in the streets versus, doing more behind the scenes diplomacy. And, there's so many different ways of advocacy. And I do think, I mean, one area that I think is opportunity or maybe underlooked is the role of the arts and music, and kind of even like images. An image can be so powerful and can be so transformative. I mean, clearly there's the role of, social media advocacy, and that can only go so far, but it can, mobilize people in some ways. And so some of these conversations about how do you translate, kind of these blips to really transformative systemic change. But it does. I mean, I think we are seeing, the power of, athletes, not only the high profile athletes, but even collegiate, any level of athlete really. And there's a lot of data that shows that it doesn't have to be a super famous athlete to have an impact. But I do think, having the Megan Rapinoe and LeBron James and, athletes that are more visible, being articulate and being prepared and having organized strategies in place. And I think that all definitely helps to help frame things out and articulate. And then even globally, what you're seeing in, particularly in soccer and football, with more of the athlete advocacy, just because of just being interested in kind of the, a lot of the historical moments of, the John Carlos and Tommy Smith, and that symbolic moment of the 1968, and then, Muhammad Ali, and, and just sort of thinking about what are those moments that are going to kind of trigger real change. And that's kind of what I've been interested in looking at, particularly around like the Rule 50 and the Olympics, and, some of these things that are now like, what's going to be like the transgender, again, back to the rugby, like, what is it? Is it going to be data? Is it going to be science? Is science, like, is research going to help convince people? Or is it going to be some kind of really creative, something different that's going to stick with the public in a way that hadn't before? So mean, I think it's just really interesting to see that there's so many different ways to approach it. And yeah, those are some of my thoughts to kick it off.
Yeah, thanks, Eli. I think one thing, Nicole, that kind of struck me when you were saying was you see the power of someone like the Man United player, Marcus Rashford. There's one guy who's used his platform within the UK. He's fed not a billion, he's fed a million. So it's not too bad, Nicole, but he's still a few behind you. But he's been able to change government policy by using his platform. And he's become probably now the most influential sportsman within the UK. And a young guy is 21. Most of the times when guys are doing this, are coming to the latter end of their careers. Here's a guy very much at the start of his career, already wanting to stand up for human rights, that every kid, poor kid, should have a meal once a day. I mean, it sounds ridiculous that it should be even a thing in the UK that they should even be arguing about. But he's been able to get government to change their policies. So I think there is that. But I think also then as well, then touching a little bit on what Eli said, I think I look at it from the other point of view. I think, again, there's an area of social media change we can have. And again, within Indonesia, we get the professional players to put it out on there and what we're doing and supportive, and it causes people to stop and think. But does it get it to change the behavior? I'm not sure. And so then that's when I really do believe in the power of them bringing in sport at the local level to bring about the change that we want to see. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's got to be a combination, because I think the power of local sport, and then when we combine it with the coaches who are then teaching about these particular areas with the role models sharing their viewpoint via their platform, I think then brings about change. So I do think it's, and I think sometimes corporate development, we go so much for kind of, let's get the pro player to use his platform. I think there's also got to be something down at the local level as well, because if we miss that piece, it's going to be nice for them, but that's them, they're famous, they're rich, they're living the dream. I'm living in my reality in this particular place. And so I think it's good for them, but it's not going to affect the way that I think.
I would just like to add in with what you just said. We have seen here, working particularly around COVID efforts, that local matters so much. And to your point, on this task force I'm on, we launched a campaign with some very famous people who said, wash your hands, do these things. What we ended up finding is that the local high school football coach had more influence because people know their name. They see them every week. They do the local car commercials. The face and the voice are so recognized that they were able to move small populations, particularly vulnerable populations, much more than your super famous person and I think it's that distance, right? It's local community versus distance, and that trust really matters.
Well, I think there's been so many studies, especially coming out from America, but this coach, whatever coach it is the second most influential person in a young person's life, next to the parents. It's not the teacher, it's not the religious leader, it's the coach. And so if that's who that is, then I think there's a huge opportunity that we need to kind of then get the messages to those coaches and inspire those coaches to use their platform exactly the same as we say to Marcus Rashford, use your platform for good. Well, then let's talk to coaches about using their platform for good. And then let's get those messages that they want to decipher back down to the young people that they have underneath their care and under their influence.
That'd be amazing if the coaches started to step up. That'd be amazing.
And one thing that, John, you mentioned beforehand, and Nicole, you shared an excellent example from the US, from NASCAR, and how the masks being an issue. And again, I think that different geographies, different level of understanding of the issue. Eli, you organized this amazing event with the Muhammad Ali Foundation, and this idea of building capacity and really helping also athletes understand what the role can be and what the implications of these are. This was something that I think from a European perspective was unbelievable to see. The example of Marcus Rashford, indeed changing policy in 1 week. And what we have been focusing on is, as a center, is really try to understand also how can we engage sport organizations in this discussion? You know, for a long time, it has not been very easy for athletes to express their views. And what we did is that we held a webinar in June focused on freedom of expression. And really the starting point was Article 19 of the Covenant on Civil Rights, which is about freedom of expression. And the idea was really to unpack what this right means, what are the limitations, if there are some, and in what circumstances. And we brought together athletes, representative from the WNBA, from the English Premier League, women Premier League, but also representatives, for example, from FIFA, the Commonwealth Games Federation, and one expert and activist on freedom of expression. And really the idea was, okay, can we look at this from a human rights perspective? What does freedom of expression means, and why is it, are there obstacles at this stage when it comes for athletes to express their views? And really we try to unpack this right, understand what it says, and it was very interesting to hear in particular from federations and here, well, of course, there may be a political and a social line that we can draw. Clearly, there are many gray lines that we are experiencing, and there may be issues arising, but it is also very important always to understand the context and understand why at a certain stage people should be prevented from saying what they want. So the debate was very, very interesting, because I think that it gave the opportunity to have a broad human rights approach to the issue, and really try to understand from a rights perspective why something should be banned and why not. And at the end, there is an ethical component that will be probably the most important thing, because you know that you're sharing celebration with other people. But having this kind of human rights guidance to provide you a way, you know, to address this issue, we thought it was very important, and we can really see that some organizations are willing to better understand, you know, and better navigate this issue and come up with new ideas.
Well, it just occurred to me, if there's only a few minutes left, so if anyone has questions, please send them, and we can see them. You know, my last sort of, I guess, question based on, you know, where the conversation's gone is, it's kind of a high level question, but I'd like to hear from each of you what, thinking, you know, in real, like, what is the one thing, may not be one, it may be a couple, but like, what is the one thing you wish people understood about human rights as it pertains to sport? Because, as you know, we talked about earlier, the depth and breadth of how sport touches all the different issues that encompass, you know, basic human rights. You know, we each come from a very different place in how we use those together. So yeah, I'd be very interested to hear, what's the one thing that you find yourself telling people the most, or you just wanting to like shake, this is so important, how do you not know this? What's the one thing that you wish everyone knew? All right, Eli, you're still not on mute, so I'm going to go with you first.
I'm going to go back on mute. Yeah, I guess that's a really good question. I appreciate the question. I mean, I guess I'll just, from kind of a human standpoint, you know, in terms of what it means to be human, and what does it mean to have dignity and rights, and to kind of have, you know, when you're going through your life, when you're going through your journey on a day-to-day basis, to each interaction, to each experience, each you know, barrier entry and so forth, that those are dignified. And so no matter your background or your, you know, the diversity of humanity, that it's really about understanding that. And I think, and that, you know, kind of echoing a lot of what Guido said too, that this applies not only outside of sport, but it applies, you know, within and through sport. And so, you know, I think that, you know, there's these, you know, comments that are made, for example, of, you know, and this is a conversation for another day, of course, are related, but, you know, the fact we see conversations about, you know, sport and politics don't mix, you know, and there's comments about, democracy and sport are not intersect, like there's these comments that are made about fundamentally what it means to be human and what it means to live in our world. And so I think it's always, to get to those aha moments of this realization about why human rights is so essential. And again, kind of going back to this notion of, because I've been in so many meetings and so many interactions where the term human rights just creates, instead of it being seen as a really important, like leaning in conversation, it's a leaning out conversation. So I think the more that we can kind of engage stakeholders to lean in on human rights, I think that could be just a huge step forward.
Yeah, I'll go next. Well, it's a big question, Nicole, for 5 in the morning. But I'll. I think for me, what I love about sport doesn't matter. I mean, I predominantly I would say team sports, but when you see team sports, they're often so representative of that local area or that nation. I think of the English football team is the diversity on the English football team in terms of racial diversity, in terms of economic diversity. I look at Indonesia as a brilliant photo from last season's game from last season, where there was one team that just scored a goal, and there were 3 guys celebrating the goal. One was praying an Islamic prayer, one was praying a Christian prayer, and one was doing a Hindu prayer, and it just went viral because it was just a picture that kind of symbolized unity and diversity. We talk about it so much, but there was a photo, there was a moment that said, wow, we can be different, but we can also be one. And that for me, and if that's the message of sport, it's that idea of respect, a little bit what Eli's already said. We can have different views on different things, but when we come onto the field, we want to put the ball in the back of the net. That's it. And it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, as Pele said. At the end of the day, it's the great leveler, and that's why we love sport, because in the changing room, we're all one. So that for me is the message of sport, and that's the message that we need to share, because I do think it leads to more peaceful and more inclusive societies. So I think, in essence, it's just respect would be the one message I would take from sport that I would love to be filtered down to the wider community.
I'm a bit building on both points that John and Eli made, but we all love sport, and we all love values such as integrity, diversity, fair play, universality. I mean, these values are intrinsic to sport. In my view, respect for human rights is a way to protect these values and to make sure that the world of sport doesn't degenerate and doesn't go south, and other elements less important, less noble than these ones basically take the leadership over them. So I think that for me, respect for human rights is really a way to protect the values of sport that we love so much.
That's nice. I'm really glad I asked that question to end on a positive note after, because some of the things we talk about, to Eli's point about leaning in versus leaning out, a lot of this stuff is heavy. So I think similar to all of you, I would say something to the effect of, because I didn't plan this, so I didn't have a prepared answer myself. I think that sport, the thing I wish people knew is that sport is a vehicle. And, we often think of sport as an escape from the big, heavy things. And so, it's a natural reaction sometimes to not want to be bombarded with those heavy things while you're trying to, escape from them. But it's a vehicle to, whether you mention through images, words, community, unity, all those words you guys used. It's a way to subtly, in a lot of cases, get people to open up how they view things or what they've been thinking about, because they're doing something they love. They're doing something that brings them joy, watching something that brings them joy, participate. And so it immediately lowers your those barriers that you have up. And so I think it's, as we all said at the beginning, it's a form of diplomacy. It's great. So we are right at the stopping point. If I have, okay, I think we timed this very well, everyone. So thank you for your time, and I'm sure that we will all run into each other again, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the day to close out the conference.
Thank
so
you.
much. Yeah. Thanks everyone
Thank
for staying up
you
late.
for
Yeah.
Great job, Nicole.
moderation.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.